humbled to be in the presence of so many eminent journalists that I admire and read daily and learn a lot from, I have to say. So, if you guys don't say it, most of the time don't have any idea about it. You call me up and you tell me about an important story, and I go, you're right, that is important, right? And then we go from there. Well, let's talk about the election. One of the things that got me thinking about it was Eddie Rispone kind of came from nowhere, very low name recognition, and he boomed out and made it into the runoff. Something that, frankly, initially, even though he's been behind the scenes, I thought, no way. Looking back at other people who've made that attempt in the past, I'm thinking about John Georges and Walter Boisseau. Both people who had quite a bit of money to spend and spent some money and failed to get much of a bang out of it, at least relative to the election cycle. So I've been asking myself the question, what is, in fact, the reason for Mr. Rispone's success? And the answer is fairly straightforward and simple. I think the answer can be summed up in two words: identity politics. Identity politics, which has landed in Louisiana. There's a culture of distaste for politicians in government, particularly among whites in rural areas, that believe government is the enemy, that those who are working in government can't be trusted, that elites are trying to undermine American values, that limiting government's power, regulation, and intrusion in daily life is in fact the answer to our governmental problems. This may or may not work for all Republicans, but it certainly works for the resurgent Trumpian Republicans that we have right now. When I say all Republicans, I say think Jay Darden. No one would confuse him, for example, as being an identity kind of person. The identity politics is personified at this moment by Donald Trump. That's the face of the identity. This is not necessarily a rational tendency exactly. I'm not saying it's irrational, but I'm saying it in the sense of I don't think people are putting together policy proposals and doing a very careful analysis of those kinds of things and saying, well, this education policy, produced these results and so forth. I don't think that's the level that we're talking about. So that's why I'm saying it's not exactly a rational tendency. It's sort of like you don't have to think about it when you see yourself in the mirror. You look at it, you don't have to go, well, the nose is there, the eyes are there, the hairline's receding, yep, that's me. No, you don't do that. There's just a gut feeling, oh, well, that's who it is. There's a gestalt about it, and Trump is a person who raises that particular kind of gestalt, a person from outside government who's going to make it right, who's going to sock it to the liberal elites. So what has this got to do with Eddie Rispone? Well, Eddie Rispone is essentially the Trump surrogate in Louisiana. He was the person who activated white voters who were fed up with liberal government and who identified as pro-Trump, who believed that someone from outside government, a business person, was the person who was going to fix something. So let's look back at, so that's what I think the key to Mr. Rispone's success, and I think that's what explains the difference between other previously deep-pocketed unknowns, essentially. And of course, Eddie Rispone is not an unknown character, but he's unknown to the general public in the same way that John Georges it was, or Walter Boisseau. It's just not a very high name recognition. So let's go back and look at some of the other factors. So that's why I think he caught on, and actually I think that's going to be the key to his success moving forward. Let's talk about 2015 through 2019. In the 2015 gubernatorial primary, there were 1,114,000 votes. That was a 39% turnout. This year it was 45% turnout, 1.343 million voters. What's the difference? Well, about 200,000 white, mostly white rural voters turned out. Why did those voters turn out? What impels rural white voters across Louisiana's 64 parishes to turn out and vote? Well, my suggestion would be, and I haven't done polling on this, so I can't be sure, but my suggestion would be Trump Jr., Pence, impeachment, Nancy Pelosi, and so on. So there's a real sense there that somehow, because of Rispone's connecting his campaign with Donald Trump's and Donald Trump's style, and then having the president, his son, and his surrogates come to Louisiana, there's a real connection to Donald Trump made in this campaign. And this points to the nationalization of politics in Louisiana, which is something that is really rising. You know, it used to be that Louisiana was really sui generis, and I regret to say that time is very fading very fast. I think we're less and less sui generis. I think, in fact, we now, except to the extent that our national politics extend all the way down into local races. I was at a forum where one of the candidates for Lafayette mayor president, who, by the way, led in the runoff and now is going into a runoff for mayor president, specifically said that people should support him because he supported Donald Trump. So there you have it for the mayor president race. Seemed to work for him. Black voters were not particularly excited about this election, so African American voters were down. Estimates are at 26.5% of the total voting population. As you may know about Louisiana, if you are African Americans can make up of the total electorate, they can make up on any voting day somewhere between 25 and 30% of the total electorate. If African Americans come out towards the 30%, then it's good for Democratic candidates. If they come out towards the 25% or even lower, it's bad for Democratic candidates. So in this case, they came out at 26.5%. If they'd come out at 29.5%, that'd be an additional 65,000 voters. That gets John Bel Edwards very close to getting 50% of the total vote. White voters hurt Edwards as well. He won only 31% of the white vote in the state. So with a lack of turnout, Edwards needed about 35% of white voters. He needed the black voters that did come out voted for him at over 90%, but he just didn't get enough of either, so he ended up in a runoff. Interesting, Rispone had a very, very different campaign than perhaps we're used to. And again, this is that break from the past that we're doing. He didn't go out. He got home at 9 o'clock most nights. He slept in his own bed. He didn't make very many campaign barnstorming things. He didn't walk in too many parades. He didn't do too many of those things. He just spent a whole lot of money, and he put on a blitzkrieg of social media and television advertisements. He capitalized on the anti-government feeling. He went negative on Abraham despite people wishing that he wouldn't, and he was successful in associating Abraham as being one more lying politician, cutting into Abraham's lead, and Abraham very graciously supported him in the runoff now, so this is going to perhaps have some import in the race. What didn't work for John Bel Edwards? So let's talk about John Bel Edwards, why he didn't get to where he needed to be. His Medicaid expansion helped 480,000 people in Louisiana, most of whom apparently didn't vote for him. Where were the majority of those are whites? Where are those whites voting for him as opposed to the whites who were turning out in rural parishes voting for the Trump surrogate? Criminal justice reform, certainly something that African American organizations across the state and other people have been really for. That didn't seem to help him. There was a perception that he was anti-oil and pro-lawyer, and that certainly hurt him. And then certainly there was no question about who Lobby and the other big business groups were supporting, and that of course was Eddie Rispone, and after that Ralph Abraham. So the new odds in the governor's race, the race is, as I call it, a toss-up, although I have trouble seeing how John Bel Edwards is going to get on a November 16th up to 50%. Where's he going to get that additional 3.5% given the changing dynamic of turnout on a runoff with lower overall participation versus a general election? There are a few important state senate, I think elections and other lower ballot elections on the runoff day, but will that be enough to pull out enough African American voters to get John Bel Edwards over that? I'm kind of doubting it right now, but he is the governor. Don't want to count him out, and he does have a smart team putting together his commercials and stuff, so I think we're going to have to see what they're going to do, but it's certainly no guarantee at this point. So what was a leaning John Bel Edwards prior to the vote is now a toss-up, frankly. A couple of other things I want to note before I turn it over to the questions and hear from you. The legislature, and this is a really big one in my opinion, is getting very close to a supermajority in the House and the Senate. I don't know that it'll be veto-proof. If John Bel Edwards gets back in, he's going to face a very Republican, a more ideological Republican legislature. In the Senate, of course, there is a supermajority. In the House, they're getting very close. It's not clear how that will hold together. Republicans in name only are mostly gone along with the white Democrats. We look at Senate District 28, perhaps Eric LaFleur's district, as an example of some of that action. So Heather Cloud, the former very, very conservative mayor of Turkey Creek, dusted two former Democratic House members, Robert Johnson and Bernard Labat, by 63 to their combined 37%. So we're really seeing a strong shift as the last of those white Democrats leave office. What did she say in her announcement? If elected, I will be a bold conservative voice in the legislature. I am a proud wife, mom, business owner, and public servant. I am running to build a better Louisiana based on smaller government, a stronger economy, and protecting our values. Okay. Joining the mayor of Turkey Creek, many more women ran for the legislature this time around, and there was the subject of a couple of articles that were well covered. Ultimately, 77 women ran for legislative seats. How did they do? Not so well. So by and large, I think right now we have 6 women elected in the Senate, there are 13 elected in the House, and maybe 7 more in contention. Those numbers leave us almost exactly where we were before, as this is one of the lowest states in terms of the overall percentage of seats assigned to women in the state legislature. The national average is about 29 to 30. We've been averaging about 16%. So as a southern state, we're lagging behind. Typical in this regard, we got more women running for office up and down the ticket, but there were 2 women that ran in my Lafayette area against legislators. Rhonda Gleason ran against Stuart Bishop, and Leslie Bork ran against John Paul Cousin. Ms. Gleason got 27%, Ms. Bork got 19%, so they were put away very, very handily. So what does that tell you? Well, women were energized by a number of things, by the Trump winning election, by the Me Too movement. Women got woke. They created organizations of different kinds and joined them, and they had lots of political activism. And when they ran, they didn't get elected. They're woke, but they're not in power. Now, maybe they will rethink that and figure out how to do it, but they need to be better funded. They need to do more name recognition. They need to start off lower and get those positions and start working up the chain if they want to be truly successful in Louisiana. One of the things that I found interesting was that this was a fairly policy-free campaign. That must have been really frustrating to you all, trying to find something to write about that wasn't just like, well, he seems ahead or he seems behind. The issue that really brings this to the fore more than any other is tariffs, right? Tariffs are hurting Louisiana. I had Mike Strain on my radio show 2 weeks ago, and he really managed to say, without coming out and saying it, that tariffs were terrible for Louisiana and that it was really going to cost us about 7% of our GDP, which is an enormous figure, multi-billions of dollars. And that's an issue that we didn't hear anything about, frankly. And why didn't we hear anything about it? Well, there's this one word that explains a lot about Louisiana politics right now. It's called Trump. We didn't hear a lot about it because those are Mr. Trump's tariffs, and Ralph Abraham and Eddie Rispone were in fact didn't want to be on record as going against Trump, and John Bel Edwards apparently figured that he couldn't do that without alienating the fleetingly few white members of the state who were going to vote for him. So that just got completely ignored. Then climate change, that's another one that got ignored. We heard nothing policy-wise about climate change, our imperiled coast, about paying for the coast, about doing anything regarding, so that completely went away. Those are two huge issues, okay? What did we argue about? Well, who's killing oil and gas? Is John Bel Edwards secretly killing it? Is he publicly killing it? Would it come back? Eddie Rispone says right after he's elected, he's going to get on the phone and call every oil and gas company and tell them to come back, we're open for business. And I hope he's going to tell them also that the price of oil has spiked suddenly so that they will actually come. Lawsuits that worked against John Bel Edwards. The surplus, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Most people I think more people bought the argument that, yeah, we like the quiet, but we really hate the idea you're taking money out of our pockets. So Louisiana is clearly an anti-tax state. Getting the budget balanced a little bit was less of an argument than saying, he raised your taxes, I think, ultimately. And lastly, the industrial tax exemption program. Certainly the somewhat minor changes that Edwards made to it made him the villain in many, many of these debates. So with that said, it's been a wild election season. National issues have taken us over, and we have 5 more weeks to go, roughly speaking. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wondering if you feel that the Trump administration are going to really put all people back in the area, bring a lot of people to the area to try to secure that.
So the question was, is the Trump administration really going to go after and bring a lot of people to Louisiana to try to influence the election? Is that your question?
Yes.
The answer is yeah, I think they are. I think we're going to see the Republican Governors Association getting even more involved. I think we're going to see money that hasn't flown in here previously coming in. I think we're probably going to see Trump surrogates a couple of times, maybe Trump himself. I think this is really going to be a major push. I mean, as it was before, of course, as you know, the Edwards administration was only elected Democratic governor in the Deep South. And I think with redistricting coming up, it's going to be really, really important to have for Republicans to have a Republican governor. We know that Bobby Jindal played an enormous role in the last redistricting in terms of shaping the districts and making sure that Republicans retain majority in what is now 5 of those districts. So, yes, the answer to your question is yes.
Can I follow up on
Sure.
Is it,
Mr. Belli?
what role is the impeachment going to be playing? Because it seemed like what he was saying on Friday night over and over again was that the Democrats are out to get me, don't you want to protect me, and don't we need to have a big win in Louisiana? Because, I mean, frankly, he's not as popular around the rest of the country as he is here. So what role is that impeachment playing in energizing Louisiana Republican voters?
The question is, what role is impeachment playing in energizing Republican voters around the state? And the answer is a great bit. I think that really without impeachment and without Trump's visit here and the surrogates, I think there's a good chance that we don't see that extra rural turnout and we don't see John Bel Edwards pushed into a runoff. I mean, it's at least possible. So I think as impeachment continues to roll out, it's going to continue to be a rally point for Eddie Rispone and for people to energize that base. It doesn't seem to be as energetic for the Democratic base or for African Americans, so it seems to raise the ire. The actions of Donald Trump seem to raise the ire of Democrats, but the impeachment thing itself doesn't seem to do that. So I think that's going to be a huge issue here. And it's almost like an issue as it stretches out that we can't see the end of it, so I think it's going to drag all the way through. They're not going to wrap it up that quickly, so that's going to be a factor all the way through the runoff. David?
What are some of the more interesting and more consequential legislative races?
your question was, what are some of the more consequential legislative races or other races?
Or if you wanted to look back to the ones that have already been decided.
Well, the Cleo Fields, Pat Smith races. Let me repeat the question, sorry. What are some of the more consequential races that I was looking at or thinking about that have either been decided or are going to be decided? The Cleo Fields, Pat Smith was very interesting in terms of funding for Cleo Fields, being funded essentially by business interests to some extent, made for strange bedfellows. Pat Smith is kind of a rabble-rouser in the House and came up and has really been forthright about education, which some of the Republican backers felt very strongly about. So that's one race that I think I've been looking at. Another race, the race up in Ouachita Parish between Jay Morris and Jim Fannin, between two Republicans. I think that's a very, very interesting race. I've been looking at District 31. There are a couple of districts where there were powerhouses before, like Nancy Landry, who was chair of the the House Education Committee. She had a 4-person race. Some of these people have run before. It's not settled yet. I'm really paying attention to that one. Of course, the Franklin Foyle, Steve Carter race has got everybody, everybody's what is it? Knickers in a twist, that's it. Because it's, 8 votes the last time I looked, and everybody's kind of pulling all that. So, it's tied now? Oh my goodness. This is like a Christmas present, right? This is great. So, probably not for them. They're probably pulling their hair out. But yeah, so those are some of the races. I mean, there are lots of really interesting races. One thing I was struck as I read through the people who were running, or who, not the people who were in office or went without competition, how many names I didn't recognize. I mean, there are a ton of new faces, and this is the second round of term limits kicking in, right? Started in 95, a bunch of people went out in 2007, now they've gone again in 2019, so we're getting more of a shuffle, and we're getting all these new faces, so I got to think that's a good thing. Yeah. Lanny?
The word Trump recurs, but also shouldn't the word Teflon be associated with Trump? But Eddie Rispondi is relatively well known even today. He certainly is no baby bitter on a personal level, but would there in fact be a kind of an obvious maneuver by the Edwards campaign to spend a great deal of money defining Eddie Rispondi in the next week or 2 weeks?
Yeah. So the question is, wouldn't it make a good deal of sense for the Edwards campaign to get out right now and try to define Eddie Rispondi in a way that was detrimental to his election chances before he gets a chance to really define himself, because he's still not very well known. And yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think, are you consulting?
No.
That is something that I think certainly, they're probably thinking of something, and we had a conversation earlier, we were talking about this, so okay, nobody knows that much about Eddie Rispondi, but what could bring him down, what could cast some negatives on his image, and we were thinking business deals, he's a big businessman, he's done construction, he's done those, so I imagine that the Edwards camp has people all over that. Let me say something about Eddie Rispondi's advertising. When he first started running his ads, I thought, and I admit that I'm wrong, I thought, this is crazy. He's just up there saying, look, I'm Eddie, and I'm playing with my grandkids, and I can throw a football. Or, I'm Eddie Rispondi, and I really like Trump. I like him a whole lot. I stand by him. I've always stood by him. I think he's just what we need. I want to be just like, and I thought, this is a completely contentless message, and I thought, this is crazy. No one will ever support that. What I didn't get at the time, I'm one of those pointy-headed intellectuals, I guess, what I didn't get was that this message is like a clarion call. It's clear. It basically reaches through. It's not complicated. It's like, I am a businessman. I like Trump. You like Trump. Support me. There's a certain genius in that. You just get rid of all the other stuff. It's not about policies. It's not about funding. It's not about anything that people have to think about. It's just like a real gut call. Trump, Trump, check. And it worked. It worked very well. And it may continue to work. I don't know. Now, I'm not on his team and I'm not on his pay, so I'm not sure what their what they're talking about exactly, but I really feel like he has to go back and remind people who he is. People have gotten comfortable. I forgot to repeat the question. So what does John Bel Edwards need to change in order to be successful in the runoff? I think he needs to go back and define himself again and remind people of who he is and what he stands for. And I think he's going to have to spend a lot of money to do that, to push through that message, that Trump message coming from the other side. But if he focuses on the pro-life, the Second Amendment, the kind of tough decisions he's had to make, the crises that he's, participated in, that he's been there, he's been around the state, that there hasn't been a hint. Well, there's been a hint of scandal, but if you can push Johnny Anderson away a little bit. I mean, if he goes back and reintroduces himself, I think, and makes that connection, and I think making the anti-partisanship, because there are some people who love Trump, but there are a lot of people who really dislike the kind of bitter partisanship that we see invading every aspect of our life on social media and elsewhere. So I think that's what he needs to do. That's what occurs to me. Yeah, so the question was, how come when Eddie Rispone did go negative against a fellow Republican, it didn't seem to have any ramifications? It didn't seem to cost him anything. And it did cost him some things. That's what I think. I think it cost him, obviously, it cost him Higgins's endorsement and a few other endorsements, and he did get some bad press and so on. But on the other hand, he was beating up Abraham for not keeping his word and for essentially being a failed Washington bureaucrat, which resonated with his own base at the time. And also, I think there's a sense that he's still one of us. There wasn't ever that separation. I mean, there's some cardinal sins in the Republican ideology right now, and certainly going after an opponent for being a tool of the administration or being an elite governmental worker who's out of touch, although obviously that's not Abraham. Those aren't sins. Let's tell it like it is. The question is, to repeat the question, have we ever seen a race in which there were endorsers, but it was endorsing a party or two candidates running? And I think that happens fairly common. We were just real focused on this race. So that's the kind of sentiment that we've heard before, particularly from national figures who come down. One's not coming to mind. Within this crowd, it probably is coming to mind to a number of people. I'm not pulling it up, but I'm pretty sure that's happened before. But it's not seen as effective because it's a kind of A or B, they're both the same. They're both great guys, so it's just not as effective. Yeah. Len?
Could you give us a quick rundown on the Lafayette mayor president's race?
Oh, yeah. Could I give a quick rundown on the Lafayette mayor president race? That's been a fun race. We initially, Joel Robideau, who of course was in the House here, he was, I think, a Ways and Means chair for a while, real inside government. He decided that he would run for parish mayor president in Lafayette and ran against Joey Durrell's second in command, and they had a very competitive race, and Joel won. I at the time thought that Dee Stanley, the other guy, was going to win. Shows what I know. And so Joel won, and then he proceeded to not be that comfortable, and he made a bunch of missteps, and he really got people mad at him. And everybody likes Joel, but he just didn't seem, his heart didn't seem to be in it, and he wasn't, nobody could figure it out. And then all of a sudden, Carly comes out and runs against him, Carly Arm-LaBar, this city functionary who quit and is now working for Robert Daigle. And he had a challenger, and then Carly got lots and lots of support, which was really a reflection of how badly Joel was doing at that time. And then Joel dropped out. So all of a sudden, Carly's has the field to herself, but then very quickly, Josh Guillory jumped in, a Republican who'd run for Congress. Nancy Marcotte, a real estate agency owner most people hadn't really heard of. Simone Champagne, who people in the Capitol would be familiar with from her time in the state legislature. And then an African-American minister, Carlos Harvin, jumped in. And so there was a really spirited five-person race. What's happening in Lafayette right now is it's energized by a structural change in government there. The 9-person city parish council has now been split into a 5-person city council and a 5-person parish council. And this is the first election they're running that. But the mayor president is still the mayor president of the city and the parish. So there's this odd structure where there's going to be separate councils for parish and city, but only one executive officer. And that's the position they're running to fill. I think it sounds terrible. I mean, I'd rather just be tortured or something. I don't know. That sounds bad. But anyway, so Josh Guillory rather, got 30%. I think most of his support came partly city, but out in the parish. Carly had the city wrapped up, and they finished one too. Simone, if she throws her support to Josh, will mean that Josh will win. That's my prediction. But you know, that's why they have the elections and count the votes, right? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Going back to what you talked about earlier about supermajority in the Senate and the House.
Yeah.
If, hypothetically, we got a Republican government, you think it's going to be conducive to a smoother legislature? We won't have so many special sessions? You think your statement might move a little bit and work for the Constitutional Convention?
I think a constitutional, let me repeat the question. So if we get a Republican governor and a Republican legislature, will that make for smoother politics? And then secondly, will there be what do I see for a constitutional convention? Let me answer the second one first. I don't see anything for a constitutional convention. I mean, you've really got it. Constitutional conventions are very hard to get together. You got to have a clear idea of what you're doing going into them. You got to marshal your support. They take an enormous amount of political capital to get together. They potentially undo so much that so many people are invested in that they make everybody completely crazy. And I just don't see, even though our current Constitution's up to, I think it's now 197 amendments, I don't see this governor, either one, having the kind of wherewithal to do that. You know, maybe Bobby Jindal, right after he got elected in 2011, might have had the ability to do that at that time if the need had been as great. But you really there was Edwards back in '72 that was really, he campaigned on that, ran on that. Everybody knew it was a mess. So that's the answer to that question. As far as smoother sailing, well, you know, I think it's going to be fractious either way, because what's going to happen is you're going to get a Republican majority in there that's not happy that we're running surpluses right now. And they're going to attempt, I think, to maybe roll that back with a Republican governor a little bit. But if you roll that back very much and anything happens in the economy, then you run into the problem of is there enough money to pay the bills? And if there's not, what do you cut? And then that leads to conflict as well. So I'm not sure that Eddie Rispone is the leader or the mastermind of the legislature in the sense of someone who's astute and knows how to do it. Just because he's been a businessman doesn't mean that he's necessarily going to get 144 people on the same page and working towards a common goal. So I think you're going to have a very fractious legislature. One last thing on that, the legislature is poised to take its own head now and run without the governor's interference. So it's kind of grown up. We've seen that. Now it's ready to go. And I'd be very surprised if the governor got much say in the speaker-president process, regardless of who that is. Yeah, I think the question is what effect will this election cycle and the things that I've been talking about so far have on next year's election cycle and the people that are going to be running in 2020? Is that your question?
Right.
Well, 2020 is a presidential election, and one of the things that's made Louisiana politics weird in this election cycle is that presidential politics pushes out everything now. So instead of paying attention to who's running the governor, we're paying attention to who's running for the Democratic nomination for president. And so many people are tuned in on that it's threatening to crowd out all the other news. So it's going to be an amazingly powerful component. It's going to be all politics all the time, and it's going to dominate these smaller elections. And I expect to see national politics creep into every school board, every possible thing, district attorney, whatever you have, attorney general, everything. It's just going to wash. What's my reaction to the trend of pillaring the press and as the fake media and saying bad things about the press and they're the enemy of the people and so on? Well, my reaction is I'm outraged about it. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you all in this room, and I'm not just saying this to suck up, you all in this room are the only thing keeping us remotely sane and keeping the republic on track, other than the people who are in the trenches of government. So, I mean, I'm a strong, strong supporter of the work that you do and the care that you take to get those stories right and get the right word out and make sure the facts are right and so on. And everybody makes mistakes. We know that. Occasionally there is a mistake made by the media, but the media is very clear that it tries to correct that mistake and so on. So I'm outraged. And I think it's dangerous. Right? It's very dangerous. I mean, they've killed, what, 11 journalists in Mexico this year? I mean, we're maybe coming to a time in this country, I hope not, where that kind of rhetoric is weaponized against members of the press. And if it comes to that, we have come to a very serious turn. I certainly hope we turn aside before we get there.
As a follow-up to that, as I was watching that speech also, I listened to the president say, John Bel Edwards is going to take away your guns. If there's one thing we covered this cycle, everybody wants to keep a gun. And there was absolutely no disagreement on Second Amendment from all the candidates.
Yeah.
And you're sort of like, well, what's the role of the media to say, well, that's not true? I mean, you don't want to be advocates for anyone. You want to be a neutral observer of things. But what responsibility is there about lies?
The question is, the follow-up was, Trump said John Bel Edwards wants to take your gun. And then that puts the media in a position of, how do you deal with an out-and-out lie? John Bel Edwards is a very well-established Second Amendment proponent. But when a popular political figure says an out-and-out lie, is it the media's responsibility to point out that it is in fact a lie, even though they're going to be called as fake news if they do so. And I think you can't finesse that point. Yes, you have to do it. And in fact, I would say the news media needs to push back if they can. I know it's very tough with advertisers and editors and everything else, but I mean, this kind of thing, you are not fake news. People in this room are not fake news, and I think you got to push back against that and push back against the kind of, and call a lie, let the chips fall. Easy for me to say, right? I'm tenured, okay? So, for now, maybe not after this, I don't know. And I think we still have a reform Bessie movement. I think it's very much the status quo is going to stay the same. If Eddie Rispone gets in there, I don't think he's going to make major education moves. I don't see him replacing John White. I don't see John Bel Edwards, if he gets returned, having the power to replace John White, given the current makeup of the Bessie board. So I think the voucher program, the charter schools, the things that are in place currently are going to continue. There has been in education, K through 12 in Louisiana, incremental progress towards goals, and things are getting better. The graduation rate is rising, and some of the other goals are being met. So I think that's going to continue as is. I don't know that Eddie Rispone or John Bel Edwards is probably going to try to get the MFP changed or get a little more money to them. I doubt that Eddie Rispone would take that on. So, but pretty much status quo. The question is, why do I think the turnout might be lower on November 16th than October 12th? Just a kind of a gut feeling. I don't think there's that much going on. I don't think we have the same animus with regard to John Bel Edwards or Eddie Rispone. I think very likely African American voting is going to be down. I don't think there's some compelling races down ticket. My sense is that the farther you get towards the Christmas holidays, the less attention people pay to politics. So putting all those things together, it's just my gut that participation would fall off. I'm thinking fall off to 40%, 39%. But fall off, we had a lot of people on the ballot. This was a long ballot, right? So if you take all those people off the ballot, you're taking away a lot of people's reasons for voting. So that's why I would